Right, Pete. This is our 7th clip, actually. I'm beginning to lose count. I think it's the 7th. But it's the final one, I think, today. I just thought it would be useful to have yet another one. But we've clearly, what in the last section you were saying, that all key social actor groups are coming together. You've got business realising they need to change in order to keep their market and the brand reputation and so on. And we've got people beginning to, perhaps they're the slowest here to move, to actually get up to date with the other group, the scientists are saying. Because, we don't always trust scientists, and perhaps rightly so. And then the government also is actually, in some countries more than others, are coming round. So you've got, and then the media is, has pluses and minuses, but
Absolutely.
All these groups are coming into it now, much more in the last 5 to 10 years. And what you ended the last piece on, which was very interesting, is that the British people and economy and society and culture and with our connections, we can make a particular contribution here which will benefit our economy and way of life and the quality of our life. So, changing doesn't mean an inferior quality of life.
Correct.
Necessarily.
Well, indeed, and as you say, I really believe that in the UK context, this is a unique opportunity. In terms of deliverables from that process, if we get it right, this is about innovation, it's about jobs, it's around selling not just technology, but process understanding and information systems, data capture systems to the world. Because I think when the crunch comes, we're going to have to run at one hell of a pace as a global economy. And we've got in our economy of 65 million people a sufficient mix. Now, of course, it's like the old SWOT analysis. Whilst these are opportunities and we've got strengths, these are also, by the same token, weaknesses and threats. The weaknesses and threats, I think, are, as you've suggested, they are over the past 20, 30 years. And the big challenge for this whole environmental debate is that it doesn't fit any of the conventional slots. We effectively moved from if you like, we came out of the caves and so on. I'm not going to go that far back, but from 1800 we made this big shift from the agrarian to the industrial, the first industrial revolution. And then we went through an engineering revolution in terms of the 40s and 50s, mass scale production systems and so on. Then we had a marketing revolution, and we're now in the midst of this next revolution, which is actually the environment, which runs as a thread across all these areas. And I'm a great believer in matrices to actually begin to understand problems. And the matrices here for me are that for people to accept this process and to be mobilised, they are first of all members of economic groups. They're secondly members of social groups, so that might be ethnicity, it might be class, it might be anything else. And finally, they are members of intellectual groups, so they might be engineers, they might be media, they might be politicians, they might be salespeople, and so on and so on. And this is like a three-dimensional matrix. And when it comes to explaining the complexity of these input-outputs on economics and technology and so on, that's a big challenge. Now, I'm not suggesting that you can actually reduce this to a forensic process where you say, right, but that's the biggest area where we need to start. But in a way, it'll be random, because that interaction for people in society will be random in response to supply chains, government regulations, taxation instruments, and so on.
There's a dynamic process going on.
It's very much a dynamic process. And each of those players will have a responsibility to just make sure that, first of all, there's this transparency to the process, that there's adequate regulation in terms of, if you like, there's no mistakes in terms of allowing things that are intrinsically unsafe or dangerous. And of course, I believe that nuclear is going to be a means to an end in this process, because reluctantly we're going to need it, I suspect.
you never know, some nuclear fusion technology using lasers. It looks very promising. It might be there in 10 or 20 years' time.
Yeah.
We don't know.
Yeah, there's some big issues there about great white hopes and so on. But in essence, we've got to assume that each of these different players in delivering this solution on the inbound side is making the right decisions against the right framework. So
to get the output right.
Yeah, and in the UK we do have the capacity, much even though you might be sort of hanging from the strap on the bus, and people bemoan the fact that the politicians don't know what they're doing and so on. I think this is going to be a time for more visionary approaches. It is a bit like a wartime economy where there are going to have to be chances taken, but on the other hand, there's a strong suspicion on my part that those choices will readily present themselves as the crisis deepens, and it'll force a more iterative system. It'll improve the science, and once we've got that as a formula, however it manifests itself in terms of communications, the media, information technology, we've got something that. If it works for our 65 million people, then maybe it'll work for the other 6.5 billion people.
Yeah.
So, you're looking at multipliers 100 times of our population that, well, more than, but we can then export these ideas and processes to the developing nations, to China and India, because when will this crunch? Well, I think it'll be a bit of a slow burn, but it will then could suddenly go exponential in the next 2 centuries. On the other hand, of course, we as a species will adapt. Although 18th century man might be transplanted here, he'd still recognise a lot of the characteristics, the human characteristics, then clearly they'd be pretty amazed.
Nature's telling us that in some areas we've got to act very quickly.
Yeah, I think we're going to get that message from nature very quickly, and that will then, if you like, act as an external impetus to drive this process forward. But of all the places to be, in terms of political stability, financial support, academic prowess, speed of communications, scale and intensity of the population density and the educational framework, then we can tick all those boxes, and this is a great reason for optimism.
We've got good international connections, and the diversity of population you mentioned as well, and we're members of different different groups, economically,
in that matrix.
Ethnically, it's a very nice little matrix, and it's just to be aware of that, because social networks and subcultures are very, very important, and each of us are in different subcultures.
Yes.
It's not, and we have different networks for different parts of our lives.
Yeah, we're moving into that interesting territory of beliefs, ethics, morality, and despite the incidents in London recently, by and large, we're talking about a very specific series of problems. I think generally we, as a species, are not necessarily all optimists, but nevertheless, there is this sense of support and proactivity to people that are different from us. We are still a single species.
And looking at the input and output problems you've been covering, we can learn from this actually to improve the input and to improve the output.
There is a feedback loop.
There's a feedback loop, and then people can actually realise that it's to their advantage economically. To perhaps change some of their behaviour if it's practical and easy to do as well. So if they separate, this kind of waste from that.
Yeah, at a mundane level.
If it's very easy to do, fine.
Yeah.
If they can reuse things or sell things they don't really need rather than keep too many possessions. So all of those sorts of things can help. And
unfortunately, you've got to go through that stage before you can then tackle the real issue. That once we've come to terms with what we as a species can do to move forward, in terms of enlightened self-interest, then we probably would have far wider buy-in from the general public about how we then visit the much bigger challenges of the atmosphere, biodiversity, the global commons, and indeed the challenges posed by the impact of that on political negotiations and political processes.
And
that's the big chestnut.
Also science and technology come in there, because we can regenerate some of nature up to a point,
Sure.
using nature to do that.
And we may have to do that in the
To
short
recover
term.
from, yeah, exactly. And perhaps, you know, taking carbon out of the air is maybe part of the way of surviving. As we are longer, we'll survive anyway, but possibly in a very nasty way if we're not careful.
I wouldn't like to end on the idea that it's going to be nasty, brutish, and short.
I think it's actually.
But there's a lot of work to do.
There's a wake-up call which shows a lot of opportunity and hope, and I think the interesting thing is Britain can actually have quite a role in that.
Yes.
And it will rejuvenate our economy and inspire young people, which I think is really a very good note to end on. Pete,
excellent.
Thanks very much. It's been really interesting.
Pleasure.
And you've certainly updated me, and I hope you'll update a lot of other people too. Bye for now.
Fine.